Europeans in Western Europe were able to do that, they began to advance leaps and bounds beyond this decentralized hodgepodge of an empire. The Ottomans realized by the 1840s, if we do not modernize, we are going to die. It will be the end of the empire. And so in 1840, in the 1840s, a new series of reforms emerged called the Tanzimat, literally the reformation or reorganization, or whatever the exact translation was, but that was their purpose. And their purpose could be boiled down into two primary objectives: strengthen the military, strengthen the state. To be able to do that, you have to reform everything from the ground up. The Tanzimat changed the legal system. They changed the land code. They changed the tax code. They changed everything. Life in Palestine became unrecognizable. I could go so far as to say the Tanzimat were as seismic of a change to the people in Palestine as the British Mandate. It was colossal scale. I will only have time to talk about their education reforms. So just to summarize precisely what the Tanzimat was, historian Bishara Dumani writes, quote, "This program aimed at modernizing the armed forces, centralizing political power, and increasing revenues from agricultural production, trade, and manufacturing. All of this required more knowledge about and greater control of the subjects of the empire, population counts, conscription, direct collection of taxes, and the establishment of political institutions which could facilitate direct central control." End quote. So, strengthen the military, strengthen the state. Strengthen the military through better training, through better conscription, through better tax revenue to be able to fund this massive project. But to be able to do all of that, you need to train people to collect taxes, to build railroads, to build infrastructure. And so education became the centerpiece of the Tanzimat. If you speak to anyone who is in their 70s now, in all likelihood, they spent some time in the Kutab education system. Prior to the standardized type of schooling that we recognize today in the Muslim world, most people who learned anything learned at the masajid. Through the Kutab system, they learn basic literacy, they learned how to read the Quran, they learned tajweed, they learned some basic Islamic sciences. Beyond that, they also learned some mathematics, some astronomy. If you graduated from the fundamentals level of the Kutab system, you studied with some alim somewhere. If you progressed beyond that, you maybe ended up at an institution like Al-Azhar. Before it became an Egyptian propaganda machine, Al-Azhar was a real university back in the day. So you went to an institution like Al-Azhar, and you could look forward to a life as a qadi, a mufti, a teacher. This was the Kutab system. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the Kutab system was not rigorous, because it was. In fact, it was very well suited to answer questions like, does God exist? What is the meaning of life? Who am I? What is my The people who graduated from that system would have been more well suited to answer those deep existential questions. Unfortunately, the question of whether God exists or not is not very effective for building a railroad. If your goal is modernization, I'm not making a value judgment here, I'm simply stating a fact. If your goal is modernization, that system was not doing its job. And so, the Ottoman Empire also had another problem, which is that while all of this is going on, while this push for modernization, a push from the bottom, is rupturing the empire, there's something called a quiet crusade that's happening in the crevices of the Ottoman Empire, and that's that missionary organizations are opening schools all over the Muslim world. This is where I'm going to start the nuts and bolts of the education story. Actually with the missionary schools, because those were the first schools, again, schools as we understand them, those are the first schools in Palestine. The purpose of the missionary schools was to convert Muslim and Jewish Palestinians, to convert them to Christianity. There was no secret about this. Fun fact, the only thing that they were successful at was converting Orthodox Christian Muslims to Protestant Christianity and converting Catholics to Orthodox Christianity, and sort of mess with the Christian dynamics, but they weren't very successful in converting Muslims and Christians to their religion. Now you might ask, why on earth would any Muslim or Christian send their children, any Muslim or Jew send their children to a missionary school? It's feeding your children to the wolves. To which I ask, how many of you would send your children to a secular post-secondary institution that pumps atheism and materialism down the throats of your young adults? And to which the answer is everyone. And you may ask, what is the relationship here? If you did not go to the missionary schools, you did not have the skills required to perform the tasks that the empire needed to modernize. You see the problem? The only people who were getting the jobs of senior bureaucrats and technicians and leaders in the Ottoman Empire in the 1850s were Christians, because they were the only ones who had the skills for these things. So eventually the Muslims felt that they needed to attend these schools as well. I'm sure they sent their kids off with some warning, right? Before they sent their, hey, do not forget, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, go. There, don't listen to anything they say about that stuff, but learn all the math and the science. There's a similar thing to what we do with our children. The elite of Palestinian society entered these schools. Families like the Husseini family, who had been ruling Jerusalem for something like 600 years at this point. They were one of the leading families in Jerusalem. Their rivals, the Khalidi family, all attended missionary schools. The great socialite and musician and poet Wasif Jawhariya, who was himself a Christian, but who has become an important primary source for understanding life in the early 20th century in Jerusalem. He attended the missionary schools. Khalil al-Sakakini, who ended up forming his own school later, he's an important part of this story, he attended these schools. Christians like Isa al-Isa and Najib Nassar, who end up playing a very important role in this story, they all attended these schools. The Ottomans saw they need to do something. And so they created an incredible education system, a two-stream education system. One stream was for civil servants, a bureaucratic school. Any neighborhood that had 500 families or more got a bureaucrat primary school. They called them Mulkiya schools. Literally like working for the kingdom. If you graduated beyond the primary school, you went to a boarding school in your regional capital. So you live in Nablus or something, you live in Akka, you live in Jenin, you live in Gaza, you'd go to Damascus to a preparatory school that's sort of like the equivalent of a high school. If you graduate from that and you're from the top of the top, you went to the elite Mulkiya school in Istanbul. There's only one problem with the Mulkiya schools. They were for fee-paying students. They're not free. So what kind of kids do you think went there? Of course, right? They became elitist schools. But there was another track that you could attend, the military schools. And these were to create elite officers, the best of the best, to be a vanguard in a reformed Ottoman military. And again, in a town of 500 people or fewer, 500 families or fewer, you would have had an elementary school, followed by a preparatory school in the regional capital. And if you were among the best of the best, you went to Maktab Ulam al-Harbi, that's the Turkish, but Maktab Ulum al-Harbiyya, the Academy of Military Sciences in Istanbul. And they were trained to believe that they were the vanguard of the empire. They were the ones who were going to save the Ottoman Empire from collapse. They absolutely embodied that. These schools were free, so anybody could attend. But they were a merit-based system. So you had to be up to the task. These schools both, you know what, I'll get to the identity component in a moment, but to just give you an idea of the type of people who went through the doors of Maktab Ulam al-Harbi, Mustafa Kemal of the Turkish Republic graduated from this school. Enver Pasha, who became one of the three heads of the Ottoman Triumvirate, went to this school. Jamal Pasha went to this school. Yassin al-Hashimi, who ended up becoming Prime Minister of Iraq, went to this school. Yusuf al-Azma, who becomes a very important character in this story, went to this school. Fawzi al-Qawaqji went to this school. Musa Kadhim al-Husseini, who becomes mayor of Jerusalem, went to the Civil Academy. There are so many people who I didn't include. Rustam Haidar, who becomes a very important part in the story, who I didn't have time to include. Shakib Arsalan went to the Civil Academy. He becomes, just a small tangent here, Shakib Arsalan in the 20th century becomes the single greatest advocate for pan-Islamic unity. The single greatest advocate. Shakib Arsalan was a Durzi. He was from the Druze sect. He is, do I have any Lebanese here? Anyone from Lebanon? From Lebanon or lived in Lebanon? So if you're not familiar with Lebanese politics, Shakib Arsalan is the great-grandfather of a Lebanese politician named Walid Jumblat. If you were to tell someone today, Shakib Arsalan or Walid Jumblat's great-grandfather was a pan-Islamic propagandist, their heads would explode. This makes no sense. Makes no sense. If I were to tell you right now that the greatest advocates in Iraq for the reunification of the Khilafah were the Shia of Karbala and the Jews of Baghdad, this makes no sense. So I'm asking you for a moment to just understand something, it's a sentence I've been saying a lot lately. We are very much tourists in our own civilization. This is a history that most of us have never had the opportunity to really sink our teeth into. The last schools that I will talk about are the Islamic schools. They were a direct reaction, an absolute direct mirror response to the missionary schools. They were K-12 schools as you understand them today, with the added mission of teaching the children Islam for the sole purpose of giving an alternative to the missionary schools. They were private institutions. They were, to be as accurate as possible, they were awqaf. They were trusts. They were founded by Islamic societies and ulama for the sole purpose of saving our children from the missionary schools. And they were very effective. But you may think, I've named all these prime ministers and generals and leaders of the world. It doesn't sound like the Muslim schools produced anyone of note. Incorrect. And to tell the story of the Muslim schools, I'm going to make a brief U-turn, and I'm going to turn back to Algeria in the 1830s, where a man named Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi was fighting the French in a war that was so noble, and he fought in a manner that was so noble that there are multiple cities in the United States named Al-Qadir, USA. There's at least 3 of them named after Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. The President of the United States at that time sent him a horse and 2 pistols just because of the chivalry of this man. He was eventually exiled by the French to Syria. And it's hard, in a few sentences, it's hard to explain the role that Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi filled in the Muslim world in the 1830s and 40s. He lived for quite a while. He actually died in the 1880s. In the Syria in which he lived, the Syria in which he was exiled, that Syria had a disproportionately high number of schools and a disproportionately high number of Islamic schools. And one leading Ottoman bureaucrat also happened to be the head of a local Qadiri Sufi order, a man named Abdul Qadir, not Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, another Abdul Qadir. And he founded many of the Islamic schools in Latqiya province. In a country that had a disproportionate number of schools, Latqiya province had a disproportionately high number of schools. So, the greatest number of schools concentrated there for a very low population. In the year that Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi died, in 1881, the year that he died, the son of the other Abdul Qadir, Izzuddin al-Qassam, was born. To say that he is the main character of this story is an understatement. He is the main character of this story. And I want you to just hang on to that. You may have heard the name for other reasons, but most people don't have a reasonable understanding of just the role that he played in the history of Palestine. But having these three education systems, 3 or 4 education systems, means that within the Ottoman Empire, we had various identities brewing. Remember that I said that the primary purpose of a standardized education is to be the vehicle of the national narrative. Well, if you graduated from Maktab Ulam al-Harbi, you came out with an Ottomanist, al-Uthmaniyya, or what they called Osmanlik. You came out with this kind of identity, that there is an Ottoman nationality that we're trying to build. If you came out of the missionary schools, interestingly enough, you came out with a very much Palestinian idea of who you are. Now, the reason for that is because that's very much the way that Europeans thought. Also, the missionary schools were very much obsessed with biblicizing Palestine. They were projecting the Palestine of the Bible onto their students. I have this mental image where I imagine that some Jesuit priest is teaching a bunch of Palestinian kids. And he says that Palestine is south of the Litani and west of the Jordan River, east of the Mediterranean, and the people that live among there live in this land called Palestine. And I imagine that one of the students puts his hand up and says, "So we're all Palestinians?" He says, "Yes." And then another one puts his hand up and says, "So you're not?" And he says, "Well, wait, hold on." And they say, "Yeah, where are you from? Why are you the one teaching us?" Now, I'm sure that never actually happened, but that probably happened over decades, in fact. But that's the thing that schools do. They trigger your imagination. It is through map making, through cartography, through storytelling, it is through that imaginative process that a nation can even exist. Well, while we are telling that story in Palestine, the same thing is happening in Europe. Throughout the 19th century, Europeans are also starting to tell stories. Their stories are a little different from ours. While we have this Osmanlik or Arab or Palestinian identity that's brewing here, and by the way, I'm focusing on Palestine, the same thing was happening in Egypt, the same thing was happening in Syria, the same thing was happening in Iraq, the same thing was happening in Anatolia. Take Palestine as a placeholder for this particular point. It's happening everywhere. And it was also happening in Europe. Their story was a little different. They invented this conception of race. This idea that if you kind of are from the same place and kind of look alike and speak the same language and pray at the same church and worship the same God, you're part of the same people. You're part of the same race. And so, the nation states of Europe began to form under very similar circumstances. And almost all of them came to the same conclusion. The Germanic people are the people who speak German, who live in this area between this river and this mountain, and who are generally Protestant in their religious leanings. The Rus people are a race, the Russians. They are Orthodox Christians. They are the inheritors of the Byzantine legacy. They speak Russian. The British Isles are an Anglican people who speak English. That is who we are. And almost all of them agreed on the same thing. Almost without exception. Almost all of them agreed on the same thing. The Jew does not belong to us. That's for sure. We might have some border regions where we're not sure, but the Jew of Berlin and of Moscow, they don't belong to us. And this is the birth of something called the Jewish question. So what do you do with all of them? If the Jew does not belong to Russia, the Russian Jew who has lived there for hundreds of years does not belong to there because this new story that's emerging refuses to include them, what will they do? What do you do when a story excludes you? In fact, we, the Muslims in the West, can relate to this better than anyone because the same is being asked of us. Can you be Muslim and be Canadian? Can you be Muslim and be French? That's a tough one. Can you be Muslim and can you be German? The Jew no longer has to answer these questions. We are the ones who answer them now. In the 21st century, it is a Muslim question. A different story began to emerge at the same time. The story said that your race and your nation and this is nonsense. The real identity that unites you is the fact that you and I toil in the factories of London and Paris. That's the story that we should unite around. And that is a story that Jews found very attractive because it didn't exclude them. People will never just give up their desire for meaning. Everyone wants to live a life that is meaningful. And so when one door shuts in your face, you'll look for another one. So while the door of the nation state and of nationalisms was shutting in the face of Jews, the door of socialism was opening. And there were a disproportionate number of Jews that became attracted to the idea of socialism. And in 1881, Tsar Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas II. Tsar Alexander was the one who was killed in 1917. Any nerds here? Anyone? Yeah. Tsar Alexander, he was the one who was, yes, okay. So Tsar Nicholas II was assassinated in 1881, and the pious peasants of Russia saw that there were a disproportionate number of Jews in the plot to kill the Tsar, and they went ballistic. And they engaged in these series of race riots that we recognize as what became known later as pogroms. These race riots attacking the Jews all over the Russian Empire. While that was happening, another story was brewing. A story that agreed with the anti-Semites of Europe. A story that said, you're right, the Jew does not belong in Europe and will never be safe in Europe. And the Jews of the world are in fact one people. This, by the way, was a hilarious suggestion at the time. The idea that the Jews of the world were one people. To imagine a European Jew like Chaim Weizmann sitting and having tea with a Yemeni Jew from Hadramaut is laughable. They would have had nothing to talk about and they wouldn't have understood each other. And when they tried to do this, they didn't understand each other. But anyways, this story is now starting to take root. That the Jews are in fact one people and they need somewhere to live. And they should go back to the place from which their story emerged, to the Holy Land. And so you have a collision course between an indigenous population who have always lived there and a settler colonial population escaping the frying pan of Europe and entering the fire of Palestine. There is a terrific, terrific story that I didn't have time to include about the first encounter between the Eastern European Jews who came from Romania and between the Palestinian Fallahin who met them. That account exists, and if you're at all interested, ask about it in the Q&A, We can talk about it then, but I didn't have a ton of time to include it. I'm going to ask Ahmed to get me more water, and I'm going to explain why for two reasons. One, Ahmed is a lot younger than me, so I feel like I'm entitled to do this. But the other reason is, I was actually early to come here, and then Ahmed called me an hour before we were supposed to come here, saying he doesn't have a ride. I'm in my 30s. I haven't had to drive people around other than my children for a very long time. So Ahmed, please, can you... Thank you. I appreciate it. And then when we were driving here, we got stuck behind a train, and I turned to him and I said, I hold you personally responsible for this. So in 1882, Imam Yahya, how am I doing for... In a minute? I'm going to need to finish this thought coherently. So how about this? Why don't I just stop now so I don't end up competing with the adhan? I already prayed Asr. Just by show of hands, who has already prayed? Anyone? Okay. In that case, basically praying right away, we reconvene 7:30. Okay. Let me just stop talking now. Okay. Khalas. Let's take a little break, at least for the adhan. I need to maximize the amount of time that I'm using, so I need to maximize the amount of time that I'm using. So after the adhan, I'll continue talking. Interrupt me. When the salah is going to start, I'll stop again. Is that good with you? Khalas. before, what kind of person does this? It will not surprise you to discover that on such a boat, there were very few women and children. It will not surprise you that most of these were very young men and very zealous. The Palestinians, time and time again, if you read first-hand accounts of the two main things the Palestinians held as grievances against the Zionists in those early days. Number one, they do not want to mix in with the rest of society. Palestinians are used to people coming from around the world. It sits at the mouth of 3 continents. The Circassians, the Kurds, later the Armenians, all called Palestine their home. But the Zionists did not want to mix in with the rest of society. That was something the Palestinians found uncomfortable. That's number one. Number two, and this will seem petty, and it won't seem that relevant to you, but it was very important to them. Number two, they're not nice. They're rude. They speak to us in contemptuous tones. You read that again and again and again. But once you discover that these are young men with a political project. These are men who saw themselves as settlers and conquerors. Then you realize, yeah, that all kind of adds up. Wouldn't it be great if we knew what the leaders of the two communities would have said to each other had they met each other? Well, it turns out I know exactly what they would have said, because it happened. Yusuf Diya al-Khalidi was the scion of the Khalidi family. He was a Jerusalemite from one of the most notable families. His great-grandnephew, no more than that, great-great-great-grandnephew, Rashid Khalidi, is a professor at Columbia University. If you've ever read anything about Palestine, you've probably heard of Rashid Khalidi. In any case, Yusuf Diya embodied every single thing that I've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. He was the product of the missionary school system. He was also a product of the Kutab system. He lived at a time where those two education systems were transitioning. He ended up studying in Malta, among other places, and he ended up taking an academic position in Vienna. He ended up taking an academic position in Vienna at the same time that a Viennese Jew was going through a transformation of his own. What would you do if you were in school and somebody in class asked, what is a heathen? The teacher is talking about heathens. And somebody says, what is a heathen? And the teacher says, well, the Mohammedans and the Jews. Well, that's exactly what happened to Theodor Herzl. That exact conversation. So Theodor Herzl spent most of his life as a cosmopolitan, secular Jew, until an event called the Dreyfus Affair kind of changed his life, where he saw, as a journalist, in cosmopolitan, urban, developed and forward-thinking and enlightened France, the persecution of an officer named Alfred Dreyfus, really which was primarily because he was a Jew. I don't have the time to get into the Dreyfus Affair, but it was transformative in Theodor Herzl's life. There were different types of Zionists at this time. There were the practical Zionists who were traveling to Palestine, putting a shovel in the ground and saying, mine. There were those. And there were political Zionists. Political Zionists were Zionists who felt that for the Jewish nation to have a homeland, we need the backing of a major empire. Now, there is something in one of the earlier slides that I didn't mention, and I have to include it here. Question of, how did the Zionist Jews and the Palestinians, how did they view each other? Were the Zionist Jews anti-Arab? It's a question I've had for a long time, and I've come to a new conclusion about this. As a matter of fact, the Zionist Jews who arrived in what they call the first Aliyah, first wave of immigration, they were not anti-Arab. But they were not anti-Arab the way that you would not be anti-cedar tree. They just didn't see them. And I don't mean didn't see them like they weren't there. I mean, they saw them the way that every settler every single settler colonial population has ever seen the indigenous inhabitants. Part of the landscape. This Ahmed or this Abdullah will not know if I picked him up from Haifa and I dropped him in Basra. He's not going to be able to tell one mound of sand from another. They did not see them as people. They're just there. They're just natives. Every single settler colonial project had that in common. Well, now in comes Yusuf Diya al-Khalidi, who's familiar with the Zionist project, but he has a teaching position at the University of Vienna, and he knows that Theodor Herzl is the leader of the Zionist project, so he pens him a letter. And he says, quote, Palestine is an integral part of the Ottoman Empire, and more gravely, it is inhabited by others. He goes on to say, quote, nothing could be more just and equitable than for the unhappy Jewish nation to find refuge elsewhere. And I'm quoting here from a book, so some of these are not his own words. But in his own words, he says at the end, quote, in the name of God, let Palestine be left alone. Theodor Herzl responds precisely in the way that you would expect from what I just explained to you. He doesn't actually respond to anything that Yusuf Diya says, because he's not talking to himself. Oh, sorry, he's not talking to him, he's talking to himself. From the perspective of a settler colonialist, if any of you have ever studied the colonization of India, if any of you have ever studied the colonization of Algeria, you could imagine that Theodor Herzl would have looked at this and said, oh, one of the monkeys learned how to button up his shirt. He's not seeing him as a real counterpart. So he says to him, in allowing immigration to a number of Jews bringing their intelligence, their financial acumen, and their means of enterprise to the country, no one can doubt the well-being of the entire country would be the happy result. Again, this is exactly the colonial argument of every single settler colonialist movement. But then he adds something very, very, very important at the end of this letter. And he says, regarding the indigenous population, who would think of sending them away? Now this is important because Yusuf Diya never asked him about the native population being expelled. He was answering a question that was never even asked. And one reason for that may be because in his diaries, he was writing about population transfer. He wrote, quote, when we occupy the land, we shall bring immediate benefits to the state that receives us. We must, by the state that receives us, he means the empire that's going to sponsor their settlement. Be it the Ottoman Empire, be it the Germans, be it the French, be it the British, does not matter. But that's who he's talking about. We must expropriate gently the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country. The property owners, that is the wealthy landowners, okay, the property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. Let the owners of immovable property believe that they are cheating us, selling us far more than they are worth, but we are not going to sell them anything back. The subject of population transfer was indigenous to the Zionist movement from its earliest days, though I would be exaggerating to say that it was universal. The Zionists, look, there are a lot of conspiracy theories about the Zionists. Most of them are untrue. They had two superpowers. Two. Number one, they had a single unified goal. Somebody asked about this when we were just having a chat here. The Zionists knew what they wanted. The Jews to be a nation and the Jews to have a homeland. A single unified goal. Number two, they stacked the deck. We as the Muslims tend to go all in one option or another. I mean, right now the Erdogan hype train is getting everybody on board. This is the guy who's going to liberate Jerusalem. And a few years ago, I was in a taxi where the driver was telling me, man, Imran Khan, he's our man. He's going to do it, right? Not if you're a Uyghur, he's not. but you get the point. We go all in. The Zionists didn't do that. Theodor Herzl, he went to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He approached the British. He approached the Kaiser of Germany. He went everywhere. They stacked the deck. They bet on every outcome. Because whatever outcome happens, they want the result to favor them. They are willing to mend and mold with the times. It's one of their superpowers. Well, an event in 1908 threw everyone off guard. I spoke about the Tanzimat, and the Tanzimat were very important, and the Tanzimat effectively ended with the rise of Sultan Abdul Hamid. And when Sultan Abdul Hamid came into power, the Ottoman Empire had lost a series of wars despite their modernization efforts, despite all of their effort to revive the empire. They're still losing wars to all of their rivals. And so, Sultan Abdul Hamid sets one single goal. No more territory will be lost. That's it. But to do that, he had to clamp down on any internal dissent. You can imagine that's a very hateable quality. Sultan Abdul Hamid has made a bit of a comeback. If you watch like Turkish dramas or something like that, Sultan Abdul Hamid has kind of been revived as a new hero. He was very much hated in his time. Well, there were secret societies popping up from within the schools that I just told you about. It's funny what kids do, right? You teach them a few things and suddenly they think they know everything. So within these schools, secret societies began to emerge, basically felt, we know how to run the empire. Like, if only people would listen to us. You're very young, very ambitious, very illegal. Sultan Abdul Hamid discovered one of these secret societies and immediately summoned a bunch of them for a court-martial. And these guys are going to be executed. So they figured, we're either going to die at the gallows or we're going to die at the barrel of a gun. Let's go out blasting. And so they went on a suicide mission to overthrow the Sultan, and they succeeded. In a revolution they never thought would succeed, they succeeded. These were what became known as the Young Turks. And in 1908, they overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid, and the response across the Muslim world was euphoric. Not everybody hated Sultan Abdul Hamid, but when people come in and they promise liberty, equality, fraternity, those things sound awesome, even if you have no idea what they mean. And they had no idea what they meant. I'm being a little bit facetious, but I'm not exaggerating by that much. They never actually explained what their vision of liberty and equality and fraternity was, but that's what they promised. The reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid is over. The reign of the secret police, the reign of shutting down printing presses, the reign of sectarianism, the reign of all of that is over. Now a new time is upon us. The Ottoman Empire is going to transform into the Ottoman nation state, where Jew and Muslim and Christian and Armenian and Arab and Kurd and Bulgarian are all going to be brothers in one nation. I'm hyping this up. I'm not giving you value judgments. I'm just telling you how they sold it. And to a lot of people, that sounded very exciting. The Grand Mufti, Grand Mufti Jamal ad-Din endorsed this. He endorsed it. He was saying that, yes, this is in line with the Sharia, what they're speaking about. It swept everyone off their feet. And to the Palestinians now, you have at least 3 stories that are brewing, all of which give you so much hope for the future. Are we going to be Ottomans? Is that our future? Are we going to be Palestinians? Are we going to be Syrians? Are we going to be Arabs? Every single one of these is a story. Which story is going to win out? The Zionists were doing the same thing. Are we going to fulfill our national aspirations through the Ottoman Empire? Are we going to fulfill our aspirations through Europe? Do we want an independent state? Do we want to be part of the Ottoman mosaic? All of these things were bouncing around. In 1908, the mood is absolutely euphoric. By 1912, Ottomanism is dead. In Palestine, it is dead. So what killed it? Palestinians believed that the Young Turks were going to put an end to Zionist land purchases. See, something I haven't mentioned at this point is when the Zionists arrived, they started doing exactly what Theodore Herzl said they were going to do. And the people who were hit first and hit hardest by Zionist land purchases were the fallahin, were the peasants. Not the urbanites, not the city dwellers of Jerusalem, not the notables, the fallahin. The first case of displacement that I was able to find was outside of Jaffa in a place called Khirbet Duran, where the Palestinians there were displaced by Zionist land purchases. Land purchases that were made possible by the fact that they purchased the land from absentee landowners. I don't have enough time to tell you that story because that would be a 4-hour talk, but it is fascinating how they got there. But the Palestinians believe that the Young Turks, they're going to put an end to this. Why? Because we now have elected representatives in a parliament, we have a free press, a booming free press, newspapers popping up all over the place that are real newspapers, not the garbage that you get in the Muslim world today, real newspapers. Newspapers like Al-Karmel, edited by Najib Nassar, a Christian, but a kind of a formative figure in the Palestinian story. Isa al-Isa, who founded the newspaper Palestine in Jaffa, also a Christian, also an important part of this story. And so in 1912, a few major forces collide at once. A group of Zionists wish to purchase land in a region of Palestine called Marj ibn Amr. And they want to purchase a huge plot of land that is going to displace thousands. And due to the Zionist ideology of prioritizing Zionist labor and homogenous Jewish communities, they will displace the indigenous inhabitants. This is what's going to happen. The newspapers are all over it. Palestine, Al-Karmel, they're writing about it. The Palestinians now, this is 1912, it's no longer 1882, they've been dealing with this for 30 years. So they know the score. So they go to Qa'im Maqam, who is like a deputy governor, Shukri al-Asali. And they tell him, look, this is what's happening. It's not like when I sell my house, you know, in Vancouver, we have a big issue with like Chinese homeowners, foreign homeowners. But when I sell a home to somebody who is a foreign national, my home does not become part of his country. But that's what the Zionists are doing. Right? So they're explaining this to Shukri al-Asali, saying they're running their own laws, they're operating their own world, they're trying to create a state within a state. You need to do something about this. Shukri al-Asali says this is a slam dunk case. Right? No problem. Let me take this to the high port, let me take this to Istanbul, I'll get it sorted out. The newspapers are writing about it. The country is watching. Shukri al-Asali, the deputy governor, is saying that this cannot go through. This is not some regular land sale. They go to the high port in Istanbul, and the high port allows it. The question is why? 1912 also happened to coincide with the Balkan War. And so, to the high port in Istanbul, they're saying, you're bringing us this provincial land dispute now? We've lost Erdin, and you're bringing this to us now? Who's buying the land? The Jews. And how much are they paying? This much. And who owns the land? Well, some foreign guy named Sarsouk, he lives in. I don't care. Let it go through. And at that point, the idea, the confidence in the idea of Ottomanism was dead. Its corpse was carried around for another 6 years or so, but the idea was dead. It turns out all of these ideas, everything that was brewing around, all of it was going to get absolutely sideswiped by the First World War. Before the First World War, I'm going to explain this word in a moment, but before the First World War, part of the Ottoman government were willing to voluntarily cede more territory. I know we're supposed to talk about Palestine. I promise this is relevant. They were going to cede more territory, and there was a particularly nationalist camp within the Young Turks, led by a man named Enver Pasha and his two colleagues, Talat Pasha and Jamal Pasha. They became known as the Triumvirate. Enver Pasha, who was 32 years old, younger than I am now, marched into the high port, took a pistol, put it to the head of the Grand Vizier, and said, basically, your resignation or your brains are going to be on this table. The Grand Vizier resigned. Liberty, equality, fraternity, it's all dead. Now the Ottoman Empire is basically ruled by three men, the Triumvirate. And these three men, two of whom are in their 30s, are now leading the Ottoman Empire into its fight for survival. A few months ago, my dad, who knows that I'm obsessed with these things, said, hey, I have a question for you. When I was a kid, and somebody was like really frantic, if they're packing up their things in a panic, people would say to them, هذا وين رايح? سفر برلك? Which means like, where's this guy going? سفر برلك? The last word is not Arabic. It's not an Arabic word. So my dad said, where does this word come from? And I was furious with myself for not knowing the answer, because I knew that the word was Ottoman Turkish and I must have come across it before. Safar Berlik was what the Arabs saw on their conscription cards when they were commanded to go to war. Its closest Arabic translation is a Nafir al-Am, or a general call to arms. The word in Arabic became synonymous with a march to hell. That's how devastating the First World War was to the Muslims. I don't have the time to tell you just how painful this was, so I'll just tell you a few facts. Between 1/5 and 1/4 of the entire population of Greater Syria died of either war or famine or plague during the First World War. On top of that, in 1915, imagine you're walking through the streets of Jerusalem, you hear the hunger pains of children everywhere. Mothers are shutting their doors just so their kids could sleep because the kid across the street is starving to death. Women of Jerusalem were reduced to prostitution at the gates of the Haram. And if that's not enough, if you think I'm being hyperbolic or I'm exaggerating, a Catholic priest later admitted that one of his congregates confessed to him that he murdered and ate his family during the First World War. Imagine how devastating this was for us. The First World War got off to a terrible start, and the Palestinians, just like their Syrian and Hijazi and Iraqi neighbors, were dragged by their ears into the front lines of this war, a war that they did not understand. The war started on 3 catastrophic fronts: in the Caucasus Mountains, in the Sinai, and in Iraq, all of which ended disastrously. So disastrously that the Europeans thought that the Ottoman Empire is just going to tip over. And so they amassed their ahzab, they amassed their forces in Gallipoli. And to the Europeans, Gallipoli was going to be a knockout blow. We're going to knock out Istanbul. We're going to take the capital. The Ottoman Empire falls. We're going to attack the Germans from their eastern flank. War is over. For the Ottomans, Gallipoli was a fight for the survival of the empire. So much so that the commander at that front, who earned his reputation there, Mustafa Kemal, told his forces, I don't command you to fight, I command you to die. And in between the time that you die and now somebody else is going to take your place, now go. That's what that fight was like. And they won. They won the Battle of Gallipoli. Now this next bit, the Battle of Gallipoli is well known. The major Ottoman fronts are well known. But I've got one little piece of obscure history for you, and the self-proclaimed geeks out there are going to love this. First of all, before I share this, how many of you, just by show of hands, would rate yourself as familiar with Middle Eastern history? And by familiar, I mean you've maybe taken a class or two in university, seen a handful of documentaries and you're kind of passionate about this stuff? Hands up. Hands up. Okay, good. This is kind of what I was expecting. I'm going to ask you again if you've heard of this incident after. Gallipoli was a huge success. And with this huge success, you have this awesome propaganda opportunity. Well, Jamal Pasha, one of the triumvirate, wants to seize this propaganda opportunity. So he organizes something called the Scientific Expedition to Gallipoli. See, Jamal Pasha at this time, he was able to amass his armies miraculously. By miraculously, I mean he took the food of local populations to feed his armies. The famine that happened in Palestine was a man-made famine. The food was being repurposed to the front lines. So people at home were starving to death. So naturally, the war is not popular. Well, now he wants this photo op. He wants this opportunity to get the intelligentsia of Syria and Palestine and Iraq and of Anatolia to come and celebrate the success of Gallipoli. And so he gathers everybody, the thinkers and the philosophers and the ulama. Mufti Shukri al-Asali is there. As'ad al-Shuqairi. Shukri al-Asali was the maqam. As'ad al-Shuqairi, who is the Mufti of Akka, he is there. Yaqubi, another Mufti from Palestine, he is there. The major nationalist leaders and everybody is there. The who's who of the Ottoman Empire has amassed in Gallipoli. And in one moment, in a stage probably not unlike this one, but frankly probably a bit more grandiose, As'ad al-Shuqairi takes the stage and he makes the case to say that the Ottoman Empire must remain united. All of these bubbling national movements, all of them need to be suppressed. All of the rebellions, they need to be suppressed. And thank you, Mr. So-and-so, for showing up and supporting us. And thank you, Mr. So-and-so, for showing up and supporting us. And over there in the back, I want to thank Amir Faisal, who has come here to represent his dad, Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Thank you for supporting us. What he does not know is that Sharif Hussein and Amir Faisal have been planning a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire that is going to kick off in weeks. He does not know that. Nobody knew that. Now, I read that and I was on the edge of my seat. How has a movie not been made about that moment? Just incredible. Everybody was there. I have this this weird, so when I'm reading through this, sometimes I try to imagine that I have like Enver Pasha or Sharif Hussein sitting around my dinner table. And I'm talking to them and I'm asking them, it's a conversation with myself. Maybe I need more friends. But I'm having this conversation with them and I'm asking them, if you knew what I knew, if you knew that what you were going to do was going to lead to the fall of the caliphate, would you have done it? And I try to imagine if I asked Amir Faisal that question, what would he have said? And I think he would have said, fall of the caliphate. The Khilafah has been dead for 50 years. We haven't been ruled by the Sharia since the Tanzimat. The Sultan, who? We haven't heard from him in decades. And 3 20-year-olds are running the empire. What are you talking about? Experiencing this history has made me a little more empathetic to the various sides of the story. If you had asked me 2 years ago, I say Amir Faisal and you say, and I would say traitor, backstabber. This is treason, easy. I'm not going to say I've totally abandoned that, but I no longer see it exactly as black and white. There were 3 promises brewing during the First World War, and this is one of those slides where dozens of books have been written about this, and I'm sitting here talking about it, and I'm going to wrap it up in 4 minutes. Sharif Hussein discovered that the triumvirate were planning on assassinating him. Jamal Pasha was planning on killing Sharif Hussein. When you retire as the Sharif of Mecca, you don't get to sail off into the sunset. It doesn't come with a pension. It comes with a knife in the back. And his son Abdullah, later King Abdullah of Jordan, reached out to Horatio Kitchener, tried to anyways, who was then Viceroy of Egypt, and he tried to get a feel for, hey, how did the British feel about this? Well, when the British lost in Gallipoli, suddenly they were thinking, an internal revolt doesn't sound like such a bad idea. Sharif Hussein fancied himself king of the Arabs. In reality, he knew that he was not, and in reality, just by show of hands, how many of you were educated in the Arab world? In the Arab world in particular. So if you were, just out of what country? United Arab Emirates? Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia's relationship with the Arab Revolt is complicated because they also ended up toppling the Hashemites. By and large, the story that is told throughout most of the Arab world in the official historiography is that the Ottoman Turks are bad, the Arab Revolt swept through and liberated the Arabs of basically Turkish oppression. The Arab Revolt almost never happened, in that it never gained this widespread popularity. That never happened. Sharif Hussein promised it would happen. The British thought it would happen. Everybody who knew anything at the time knew that it wasn't going to happen. But it was successful in creating division. And it was successful in distracting the Ottomans and creating just one more front in the war. Now, I'm going to get stuck there for a long time if I don't move on, so I'm just going to very awkwardly transition into this next point, which is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. While the British were promising Hussein rule of the Arab world, they were also promising the French that they were going to divide the Arab world between the two of them. While they did that, they also were motivated by their own Christian Zionism and their own post-war considerations to create a Jewish enclave in Palestine. And so, in 1917, they published the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration absolutely blew the French away. It knocked the wind right out of the Arab Revolt. Do you know who wasn't surprised by it? The Zionists. Do you know why? Because they wrote it. Because Chaim Weizmann was there when it was written. Chaim Weizmann knew more about the Balfour Declaration than Lord Balfour because he sent it back to him. Imagine that. In late 1917, the Bolsheviks published the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And so in late 1917, the Arab Revolt, the Balfour Declaration, and the Sykes-Picot Agreement all emerged at the same time. Imagine if you were just sitting in Jerusalem watching the news. Well, they weren't watching the news, they were reading the news. If you were getting the news in Jerusalem at that time, you would have no idea what's going on. The sky is falling. Absolutely blown away by 3 seismic discoveries. Within that year, just a few weeks after the Balfour Declaration has been published, Jerusalem is surrendered. The last Ottoman troops leave southern Palestine. There's a bit of fighting in Nablus, but essentially, British rule is upon us. And the Palestinians, 90% of whom are Arabic-speaking Muslims or Christians, 10% are Christians, 80% are Muslims, another 10% are Jewish. But suddenly, that 90% Muslims and Christians are referred to by their new British rulers as the non-Jewish population. Imagine if, so we have Kabir, we have the rest of you, and I refer to the rest of you as the non-Uyghur population of this room. Is that a sensible way to describe this room? Does that make any sense? That makes just about as much sense as referring to the Palestinians as the non-Jewish population. David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain, meets with his counterpart, the French prime minister, who is very worried about, now in 1920 rolling around, very worried about all of these interwar promises that the British have made. They made promises to Sharif Hussein. They made promises to the Zionists. And David Lloyd George says to his counterpart, our friendship with France is worth 10 Syrias. We would never honor our promises to them over our promises to you. I'm going to have to pick up the speed. This is probably the hardest slide, and I'm going to have to go through it very quickly. Ahmed, if you don't mind. I can't ask somebody else. I don't know all their names. Thank you. Funny because he's the oldest sibling in his family, and I'm sure he orders people to do this all the time. The European powers were blown away by the number of petitions they got before the mandate was officially established. They were blown away by this, but any Ottoman government official would have found this very normal. This is how Muslims used to communicate with their sultan. If a governor was being bad, if a mayor was being bad, the Mukhtar of some town is annoying you, you mail his boss. It's like sending an angry email to the manager. Thank you. And so the Palestinians began furiously petitioning the League of Nations, saying, we wanted to remain Ottomans, and we certainly do not want to become British. So, thanks, but no thanks. The League of Nations devises a caveat. We will only accept petitions from outside of the country. Well, there aren't a ton of Palestinians outside of Palestine, but there are a ton of Zionists outside of Palestine. And so they're able to send letters directly to the League of Nations, but we are not. The main Zionist goal at that time was separating the Palestine question from the Arab question. At that time, if you had asked British and French intelligence, what is your top concern? Who are you afraid of that's going to spoil your plans? They would have said, without a doubt, the former Ottoman officers. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Ottoman army never decommissioned. Those guys went home with their rifles. For those of you who are old enough, think Iraq war de-Baathification. What were the Americans worried about? They were worried about the generals and the officers in the Iraqi army going in and joining insurgencies. Well, these guys, like Yassin al-Hashimi, like Yusuf al-Azma, like Fawzi al-Qawaqji, all of the graduates from that school at the beginning of the story now went back to their hometowns they had not visited in decades, with all of their knowledge of how to fight a war. They went back suddenly as Syrian nationals, whatever that meant. They went back as Palestinians. They went back as Iraqis. They went back, but in their mind and in their heart, they were Ottomans. They were trained for that. Yassin al-Hashimi and Yusuf al-Azma were dragged kicking and screaming to join Faisal's army. Amir Faisal took up shop in Syria, and they were dragged into supporting him because they didn't want to, because they had just spent the last 6 months of the war fighting against him. But they had nowhere else to go, nowhere else to be. In Palestine, they're fixated on fighting against the Balfour Declaration, and the fight against the Balfour Declaration in 1920 reached a peak in the riots of a religious festival called Nebi Musa. It's a very long story, but to sum it up, the fury against the Balfour Declaration manifested itself in this massive riot that ended up leaving a few Arabs and a few Jews dead. And suddenly, for the first time, the British realized that contrary to what the Zionists had been telling them, the indigenous population may not be so happy with what we're doing here. For the first time, that came to their attention. Of course, if they had been listening to the indigenous population, they would have discovered it much earlier. But the Nebi Musa riots created a great propaganda opportunity for the Zionists and for the French to say that the Jews are being attacked in Palestine. And the French got their opportunity. Remember, the French have been promised Syria. Yusuf al-Azma and Yassin al-Hashimi, graduates of that school, dragged Amir Faisal to the throne and against his own desires declared him king of Syria. He wanted to work with the French and negotiate and maybe we could find a way. They knew better. And so they proclaimed him king of Syria, held a celebration, but with the Nebi Musa riots, the French were able to say, we are going to come in and crack down on this anti-Semitism, crack down on this persecution of this minority. And they came in with the full might of the French army. The leading French general who came in gave the Syrians an ultimatum: surrender now or be crushed by the French war machine. Yusuf al-Azma was trained in the most elite military academy in the Ottoman Empire. In the Battle of Maysalun, he knew it was a suicide mission. They fought and died not because they thought they were going to win, but they didn't want Syria to be surrendered. But that was the end of the Arab kingdom of Syria. And at that time, had you asked the majority of Palestinians, what do you want? They would have said, we want to be part of Syria. We want to be with our brothers on the other side of the border. After 1920, this dream was gone. But there was still another dream alive. The hero of Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal, he's going to save us. Mustafa Kemal was writing to the Mufti of Damascus saying, make dua for the Mujahideen in Anatolia who are fighting against the Armenians and the French, and they were making dua all over the former Ottoman Empire, the Arab parts of the Ottoman Empire, for Mustafa Kemal the Mujahid. Until Mustafa Kemal made a secret deal with the French, where the French who believed that Mustafa Kemal's army, which was actually the former Ottoman army, was going to march to Homs and destroy all of our plans. So the French, without the permission of the British, said, we recognize the revolutionary government of Turkey as the legitimate government of the Turkish Republic. Please don't attack Syria. And he complied. The Turkish Republic was born. The Mujahid Mustafa Kemal became the secular reformer Mustafa Kemal. Within 2 years, he would abolish the caliphate. Nobody in the First World War thought the caliphate was going to collapse. Nobody. Not the British, not the Muslims, not the French, not the Russians, no one. Everyone figured a puppet caliphate will exist, but the caliphate being gone, no one thought that. As a consequence of the Nebi Musa riots, the British removed Mayor Musa Kazim al-Husseini, the mayor of Jerusalem. They removed him, and they put his arch rival from another tribe, Raghib al-Nashashibi, as mayor of Jerusalem. I'm going to say this again because I feel like, how many Palestinians do I have here? Anyone? Names like Husseini you might know, because there's a handful of them in Vancouver. It's a very well-known family. Nashashibi you might not know as much, but for the rest of you, I'm going to repeat this. Musa Kazim al-Husseini was mayor of Jerusalem. The British removed him and put Raghib and Nashashibi, their rivals, as mayor of Jerusalem. But then they created out of thin air a religious office called Grand Mufti and a religious institution called the Supreme Muslim Council, and they put at the head of that Hajj Amin al-Husseini of the Husseini family. Now try to figure out, you're a smart group, I'm sure, why would the British put a Nashashibi in the civil office and a Husseini in the religious office? And if you have not connected the dots yet, let me connect them for you. At this point, the British have been ruling colonies for centuries. There is no one, there is no empire that has ever existed that has perfected divide and conquer like the British. No one. Not the Americans, not the French, not the Soviets, no one. They were the best. And by the time they got to Palestine, they had perfected it. The British could not create divisions, rather they could exploit them. They would find where divisions already existed, and they would amplify them. And were I not the victim of this division, I would find it very impressive. But this is what they did. And so you had these rival offices that could not work together. They could not cooperate, whatever their efforts were. There's so much more that happens here. And it's not as black and white. Some Husseinis worked with the Nashashibis, some Nashashibis worked with the Husseinis, but this rivalry between these two massive egos would go to characterize the 1920s. More broadly, the British were running basically two colonial systems in Palestine. The British were running two colonial systems in Palestine. One that's basically the India model, which is that these are savages and we rule them and we decide what they learn and what they eat and where they go and how they get there. The Jews got the Canada model, right, which is the type of colonialism you institute over white people, or the South Africa model, which is that they're basically autonomous, but we get the final say. There are two parallel systems running side by side, and this whole time, the Palestinians are primarily fixated on one goal: overturning the Balfour Declaration. Their relationship with the Zionists, at least the relationship of the official leadership, is very complicated. Because, keep in mind, the success of the Zionists is not guaranteed here. The Palestinians cannot read the future. They don't know what's around the corner. So they believe that with enough effort and enough petitioning, they're going to overturn the Balfour Declaration. Surely you cannot ignore 90% of the population. Surely, eventually, you're going to listen to the overwhelming majority of the native population. And this just never happened. But this is where their efforts were. The leadership owed their positions to the British. The Grand Mufti is an employee of His Majesty's government. Raghib al-Nashashibi is an employee of His Majesty's government. And what makes matters worse, you know, the myth that Jews run the world is a myth. It's not true. But it was true to the Palestinians. If you had a problem, if you had an issue, you had a conflict with a Zionist or a conflict with your neighbor, you went to Zionist, long-time Zionist, apocalyptic Zionist, Wingate. Can't remember his first name. And if you couldn't get your problem solved by him, then you went to lifelong Zionist, British Jew, High Commissioner Herbert Samuel. And if you could manage to get past Herbert Samuel, you went to Colonial Secretary and lifelong Zionist, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, who gets all his information about Palestine from the head of the Zionist organization, Chaim Weizmann. It's like one of those Russian dolls where just each layer has another layer. Imagine, if you ever wondered, like if you are a Palestinian, more broadly an Arab, we're a generally paranoid bunch. My mom, until today, does not speak with the police. Just as a note, we're very suspicious of authority and generally are conspiratorial, paranoid people. And if your grandparents, if you're still fortunate enough to have your grandparents still among us, you will see that they embodied this paranoia. But when you read what was happening in the 1920s, give them a pass. You need to understand this was well placed. Because while all of this was happening and they're seeing that everyone around them is ignoring the indigenous population, the Zionists have a policy, which is another acre, another goat. Just keep buying little bits of land. Keep eating up just a little bit more, a little bit more. Nobody's going to notice until it's too late. By the 1920s, Haifa became a microcosm. Haifa is a city in northern Palestine. And it became a microcosm of the entire Palestinian problem. Most Zionists who were arrived at the port of Haifa. But most of the fallahin who were displaced also lived in shanty towns and slums in Haifa. How many Palestinians were being displaced? By 1929, between 1/5 and 2/5 of all Palestinians were displaced and living in slums in Haifa. That is a seismic change. 2/5 of your population going from being peasants to being homeless, to living in the slums of Haifa, in places where alcoholism, gambling, brothels became common, where people degenerated. Their entire society was falling apart right before their eyes, and there just wasn't a ton that they could do about it. And one symbolic moment was when the British wanted to build this luxury highway for the Zionists who lived in Haifa, who lived on the mountain, called the Kingsway, and it was going to destroy the slum that the Palestinians lived in. So just imagine that you've been displaced, but now even your shanty town is going to be taken from you. It's one compounded humiliation on top of the other. What makes matters worse is that somebody like Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini, somebody like Musa Kadhim al-Husseini, somebody like Raghib al-Nashashibi, they would have never rubbed shoulders with the fallahin. They didn't know them. They were the a'yan, they were the notables. They didn't. It's like our politicians now. You know, these are humans at the end of the day. These are not, they had their position based on lineage and prestige. That's it. By 1929, tensions are absolutely at the surface. The Jews, internally and externally, began speaking in two different tongues. Internally, the rhetoric was, we want access to pray around the Wailing Wall. Externally, they were saying, we want to purchase the Wailing Wall. We'll pay any price. What made matters tip over the edge was in the summer of 1929, some right-wing Beitar paramilitary youth. The Beitar paramilitary was founded by a guy named Vladimir Jabotinsky. He later went by the Hebraicized name Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Ze'ev is Hebrew for wolf, and this name suited this guy perfectly. Just a fun fact, Benjamin Netanyahu's dad was Ze'ev Jabotinsky's qahwaji. He was his errand boy. So it gives you an idea of where the Zionist right wing emerged. Well, some of Ze'ev Jabotinsky's henchmen went and marched around Masjid al-Aqsa singing the Hatikva, which became the Israeli national anthem. The next week was al-Mawlid al-Nabawi, and it exploded into an all-out revolt. Not just any revolt. See, the people that were revolting were not from Jerusalem. They were from the countryside. They were the fallahin. They were from the slums of Haifa. And this unhinged rage exploded all over Palestine. For a week, it was just chaos. They were running straight at British police. It was not led by anyone. It's a great question. It didn't really have, it had instigators. A young sheikh named Ismail Tubasi gave a fiery khutbah right before al-Mawlid. A khutbah so fiery, he fainted. To give you an idea of egging them on, of saying we have to do something. A much more notable alim, al-Muzaffar, tried to calm them down, but by then the cat is out of the bag. This is pure rage. This is not a political program. There were organizers, but there were no leaders. We'll talk about the organizers in a second. The problem with this was that it was directionless. And many of the Jews who were killed in the process were not Zionists. They were just the indigenous Jews that had lived there for hundreds of years. They were Jews who didn't know yet, are we Zionists or are we Arabs? But this made the decision for them. It's a rough chapter. And it's a chapter that is commemorated with 3 men. Atazir, Muhammad Jamjoom, and Fuad Hijazi were the 3 men held responsible for the riots. And in their trial, the British deemed it inappropriate to make this a political trial. It's not about politics. And so, no political defense. The problem is the issue was political. So anytime their defense tried to explain the political circumstances, the British said, this is not a political trial, this is a criminal trial. Muhammad Jamjoom, Atazir, and Fuad Hijazi were led to the gallows, but before that they left a note. They said, at the end of our lives, we say to Arab leaders and Muslims all over the world, do not trust the foreigners. We lived and died for the Arab cause. Right after this, Hajj Amin al-Husseini tried to organize a conference supposedly to accomplish 2 goals: to bring attention to Masjid al-Aqsa and to revive the caliphate. What he really did was bring attention to himself as the leader of Palestine. It was really like the main, for him personally, it was an enormous success. For Shaukat Ali, the Indian Muslim scholar who wanted to revive the caliphate, it was a disaster. The caliphate wasn't even brought up. But what it showed was the state of disunity at that time. Because the Egyptians were not willing to send an official delegation because Egypt had its own problems. And the Syrians were not willing to send an official delegation because Syria had its own problems. The type of thing that you hear now, they were hearing for the first time in 1930. And so you have thousands upon thousands of fallahin, displaced, nowhere to go. You have a political leadership that is employed by the British that cannot really speak against the British, and to some extent who view the British as their allies. And suddenly, you have a moment of clarity. Mark Sanigan is a historian, and he chose very well when he titled his book Lightning Through the Clouds, because that's exactly what this next character did. He was like a bolt of lightning that just provided this sudden moment of clarity among this wave of obscurity. As Mark Sanigan writes, quote, in the rat-infested, tin-hot slums of Wadi Salib and Ard al-Ramil, young Palestinian men, disaffected by the protean political, economic, and social problems, looked somewhere for a source to give voice to their complaints. The traditional Palestinian leadership in Jerusalem was unwilling and increasingly unable to address the root cause of these problems. Instead, from the mosque's kutab came a thundering voice who argued that the cause of the problems facing Palestine were not, in fact, unique to Palestine. Colonialism, Italian, French, British, and Zionist, was afflicting Muslim lands long before the end of the Ottoman Empire. This voice did what many in Jerusalem were unwilling to do. Turn to the landless or dispossessed fallah, point at the British or Eastern European Jew, and say with credibility, here is the cause of your despair. What made him unique was his willingness to sacrifice everything. Every scene that I have told you so far, Izz ad-Din al-Qassam has been in the background. When the French crushed the Syrians, he was there fighting in the mountains. And he discovered in the mountains of Jabla, the rich cannot be trusted. The Syrian revolt against the French originally was packed with effendis, children of merchants who were fighting against the French. But the French realized very quickly, go to their effendi uncles and tell them, if your nephew fights against me, I will take your business, I will take your farm, I will crush your family, and you will become as poor as the fallahin that work for you. Sure enough, within a few years, the effendis were collaborating with the French against the revolution that they were a part of. So Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam knew the rich cannot be trusted. Also, because the French were a much more blunt instrument than the British, they weren't as good at this whole divide and conquer business, he saw the picture for what it was. Hajj Amin and Raghib al-Nashashibi and these, they were still fuzzy on the relationship between the British and the Zionists. He was the only one at the time saying with credibility, this is clear. They are working together against us. But he wasn't just a mujahid. He wasn't just a fighter. He started out in Palestine when he left Syria marked for death. He started out as a school teacher. And when one of his students asked him, what are you going to do, or how do you plan on liberating Palestine? He pulled his jacket back and pulled out a gun. And he said, with this. He knew exactly where he was going. He knew what he was about. He was then transferred to Al-Istiqlal Masjid, a masjid in front of which the Kingsway Road was going to be built, that was going to displace all of those fallahin. And one of his contemporaries described his khutbah as, quote, like experiencing an earthquake. Something else. Perhaps one of the most interesting parts of his story was that he was the founder of the Palestinian Arab Association of Workers, the labor union. We don't typically associate shuyukh and ulama with labor unions. We tend to view these as independent circles. But the reason why Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam operated both of these worlds is because if you wanted to look for him in Haifa, you couldn't find him in the coffee shops, you couldn't find him in the office of the British High Commissioner. You wanted to look for Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, go look in the slums, go look in the gutter, because he was daily having lunch with the displaced fallahin. These were his congregates, these were his people. And so developing a labor union to give them purpose, to allow them the means to negotiate better wages, these were his people. These were the people showing up to his khutbah. He said in his own words, quote, look, my hair has turned white. I have a lot of experience which made me hope for something good from peasants and workers. He knew from his experience in Syria, liberation is going to come. It's going to be from these people, not from the effendis. He got his opportunity because in October of 1935, something amazing happened. Some ships were being unloaded in Jaffa. And the ships that were being unloaded had cement that was being taken to one of the Zionist settlements. And one of those blocks of cement fell, and a group of Arab dock workers became very anxious. The British supervisor came over and realized why they're so anxious. Because in the blocks of cement that were going to the Zionist settlement were submachine guns and ammunition. And so they went and cracked open all of the blocks of cement and found that they were all full of submachine guns and ammunition. And the Palestinians realized, we've been asleep at the wheel. While we've been talking and petitioning and lobbying and asking and begging, the Zionists have been arming and preparing for a war. How long has this been happening while our leadership has been asleep at the wheel? Very shortly thereafter, Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam took to the minbar and he implored his people to fight and disappeared into the mountains. From that point on, Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam was no longer in the masjid. He told his friend Ibrahim al-Hajj that he was going to start a revolt. They asked, how many men and how many guns do you have? He says, we have 15 guns and 1 cartridge of ammunition for each. 15 guns to fight the British Empire. But he knew that the time for talk had ended. The people had had enough of that. He just wanted to be the initial spark, because they knew that Syria had fought a revolt against the French from 1925 to 1927. They know the score. They know how this goes. But he was hoping that he could just light the spark through the Palestinian Arab Association of Workers. He had been creating independent cells of fighters so that they could operate on their own, because there was no other way to fight this. Late 1935, one of his fighters was picking some grapefruit and he was spotted by a British police officer. They got in a gunfight, killed the British police officer, and now the sky fell on Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam. Cornered in a cave, they were asked to surrender. And he implored his men to die with honor. And just like that, it was over. And at the time, the Palestinian leadership could not understand the significance of what had just happened. The British wrote officially that we killed a gang of thugs and thieves and zealots. But something else had happened. Yunus al-Khatib, a contemporary, said, I heard you preaching from this minbar, leaning on your sword, and now that you have left us, you have become, by God, a greater preacher than you ever were in your lifetime. The message of Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam was a message to the Fallahin. And a few days later at his funeral, 30,000 people showed up. That was 4% of the population. 4% of Palestine was at the funeral of Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam. If Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam was a bolt of lightning, his funeral was the clap of thunder that follows. Because after his funeral, a general strike was declared in the urban centers of Palestine, but the general strike transformed into a peasant revolt. And that's where we started. What's happening here is that the villagers of Abu Ghosh are pledging their allegiance to the revolt against the British. And I think they're happy because they think they're going to win. There's an Irish saying that says that, do you know why the sun never sets on the British Empire? And the answer is because God knows what they're capable of doing in the dark. In 1936, the Palestinians revolted against the British. In 1937, the revolt became a full-blown insurrection. And by 1937, the British Empire, the greatest empire in the history of the world, mobilized its full force to suppress the revolt in Palestine. Between 1936 and 1939, the Palestinians were about to discover just what the British were capable of when the lights go out. But I'll have to save that for part 2. This is, thank you. This is emotionally very draining. And this is why, when I was asked if I could do part 2 in a few weeks, I resoundingly said no. I can't put myself through this every few weeks. At least when I record a podcast, I get to turn it off and then go cry in the shower. You don't all have to listen to that. When I do this, I don't get afforded that luxury. So thank you for putting up with that. But especially for the younger people here, I have to say this. This is not related to exactly what I said, but it's very important. It's a kind of a backroom discussion that me and some of the other brothers have had, and I'm young enough where some of you still think I'm relevant, but I'm old enough where some of you have to call me Ammo and you have to listen to me. So we have a lot of egos in our community, and we had a lot of egos in Palestine. And if my goal is to get a few more dozen listeners to my podcast and maybe get a few followers on Instagram, I think I've accomplished my goal. If that's your goal, not only is it silly, but you're wasting your time. We have a cause that we're working toward, a cause of liberation for not just Palestine, but for the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I don't have patience for egos. And I know I'm seeing you nodding because I feel that many of you agree with me. We have enough egos in our community. My goal here, more than to teach you facts, was to make you care. If I have accomplished that, I've accomplished my goal. I don't know if I've successfully changed all of what you know, but I hope I've changed a little about how you feel. If I've accomplished that, I've accomplished my goal. With that, I've gone a little past what I was expecting. I could do 5-10 minutes of Q&A. I know that's not a lot, but I'm sure maybe we could do like a Facebook group or something, like some type of mail-in questions where I could answer other questions as well. But if any of you have any urgent questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes? Sorry? The Tanzimat. The Tanzimat was a reformation or reorganization campaign to modernize the Ottoman Empire, primarily through modernizing the military and centralizing the government. If you wanted it in like a Twitter format, that's the Tanzimat. Yes? The Zionists, and Lawrence Oliphant, this Christian Zionist from Britain, is on a boat with a group of Romanian Zionists, and they arrive in Haifa. They're greeted by a bunch of fallahin, and he notes just how juxtaposed these two communities are. But one thing that he notes is that the Arab Jew is much more similar to the Arabs than he is to the Zionists. By reading that moment alone, you get a real sense of the settler colonial and indigenous population. For that, look up Lawrence Oliphant, Oliphant with a PH, Haifa. He has a book that you could find on Amazon for free. Yeah, Life and Times in Haifa, something like that. Yeah, it's his diary. Yes? Azzuddin al-Qassam? Absolutely. Mark Sanigan, Lightning Through the Clouds. Just a heads up, this is an $80 book. So it gives you an idea of how the amount of money that I have spent to do this research is jaw-dropping. I try not to reflect on it too much because it hurts, like physically it hurts. But these books are very... smoking crack would be a cheaper addiction than buying history books. I'm not telling you to do drugs, like, Haytham. Okay, so, but you get my point. Like, history books are incredibly expensive. Okay, yes. Sorry, are there any questions on this side? I keep like, you know, modesty and respect, but are there any questions on this side? Anyone? Anyone? Okay, yes? Condoned and endorsed? Yes. You know, I have like a blurb in another PowerPoint presentation, but his justification was not like religious. It was not rooted in the Sharia. It was generally that the way that the empire has been going was contrary to the Sharia. Autocracy is anti-Islamic, and liberalism is Islamic. Liberalism not like the NDP, not Trudeau's liberalism, liberalism in the classic sense, which is like freedom of thought, freedom of movement, freedom of association, personal liberties. Yeah. Yes? Resistance from the Jews or resistance from the Palestinians? 100%. Yes. The Zionist movement had resistance. First of all, within the Jewish community, there was resistance to Zionism. Within the Zionist community, there was resistance to the treatment of Palestinians, embodied by the cultural Zionist Ahad Ham, who wrote that we treat them with contempt. This is in 1896. He said that, look what we're doing to these people. We treat them like trash, right? And sooner or later, this volcano is going to burst. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but almost it's quoted so many times in so many books. Yeah. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So a few things. In Palestine, psychiatrists don't call trauma post-traumatic stress disorder because it's not post. The trauma is enduring. Likewise, this is not history because it actually never ended. One thing, when I'm speaking with like superintendents, directors of curriculum, deans of education, when I'm speaking with these people, I ask them all exactly the same question. When did World War I end? When did World War I end? Now watch this because I'm a petty school teacher. Ladies in the back, when did World War I end? I do that to my students who are talking. When did World War I end? And this is the same face that you guys have when I do it to you. See, it doesn't change even when they get older. So when did World War I end? Right? November 11th, 1918 is when we commemorate the end of World War I, right? At 11/11. Yeah? But in the Muslim world, World War I never ended. It never ended. The Ottoman army never decommissioned. The same army that fought in Gallipoli was fighting in Turkey for Turkish independence. Yassin al-Hashimi goes on to become prime minister of Iraq. He trains an army there to fight against the British. He trains people there for independence. All of these former Ottoman officers, Izzuddin al-Qassam fought in the Ottoman army. The war never ended. Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, today are still fighting the First World War. We are fighting the war and we're fighting the peace that came after it. So it's not history. It's a continuation of that story. As a general rule, Arabs have long memories. And I have a longer memory than most. And with that, when you read history, look, to me, the revolt that I'm going to tell you guys about in part 2, to me it's like it was yesterday. it's like I was there. Like when you read a dozen books on one war, you feel like you were there. Now, read those books and then go watch England play and tell me you don't wish that they get smashed by Italy, right? Like, I harbor resentment about that because it doesn't feel like 100 years ago to me. It feels like yesterday. The lesson from it, though, if I could draw any hope from the future, is that the Algerians fought for over 120 years, and they got independence. And we, because we're pampered Canadians, we think independence comes from asking nicely, but independence sounds and smells like cannon fire. Usually doesn't come by asking nicely, and not from the type of colonizers that we have. I am most proud, if I could end on an optimistic note, I am most proud of the fact that at the end of Ramadan this year, Palestinians from the West Bank and from Gaza and from inside 1948 Palestine all rose up in revolt for the first time since 1936. I'm most proud of that. And so, David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann believed the old will die and the young will forget. But we have very long memories and we haven't forgotten. Any final question? Anything? Yes? I'm not sure, when you're saying for the Palestinians, do you mean their understanding of what was happening in Istanbul or their own leadership? With their own leadership, their leadership were in a position, the era is called the era of notables, right? They had inherited these positions through their lineage, which I'm not going to belittle, but it was from a bygone era. And now that they were in a national role, they weren't really, simply put, they were not prepared for that responsibility. Right? They still saw themselves as the representatives of their tribe and their town. They didn't really think that what was happening to the Fallah was their responsibility. To the extent that they were communicating with their people, we could probably have a two and a half hour discussion on what it means to be a people. And that's actually a really important part of the question that you're asking is, if I am an official responsible for a community, where does that responsibility end? Right? Izzuddin al-Qassam felt that he was responsible for the well-being of the Palestinian peasant, and he was from Jabla in Syria. Like, forget the fact that he's not a notable, or he's not even a local. He's not even from this town.